Shanda Sharer was born on June 6, 1979, in Pineville, Kentucky, to parents Stephen and Jacqueline. Her parents later got divorced and her mother remarried. Shanda, her mother and new stepfather, later moved to Louisville. Whilst in Louisville, Shanda attended St. Paul's School for a brief period, where she was active on the cheerleading, volleyball and softball teams. As mentioned, her time here was brief because her mother soon got divorced again and moved with Shanda to New Albany, Indiana in June of 1991. Shanda enrolled in Hazelwood Junior High, where she had no problem fitting in. By all accounts, her outgoing personality meant that it was easy for her to make new friends. It wasn't long, however, before Shanda got into an altercation with another girl. This girl would later be identified as Amanda Heverin. Things would take a turn, however, when both girls were put into detention and got talking. They quickly became friends and later began to exchange romantic letters. Shanda was only 12 years old at this point, but knew that she was interested in girls. In early October of 1991, Shanda and Amanda attended a school dance together. This was their way of letting their classmates know that they were official and they didn't care what anybody else thought of them. Unfortunately, what wasn't known to Shanda was that one person's rage was burning against her. This was the 14-year-old ex-girlfriend of Amanda, and her name was Melinda Lovelace. Melinda Lovelace was born in New Albany on October the 28th of 1975, the youngest of 3 daughters to Marjorie and Larry Lovelace. By all means, her environment was a strange one. Her father Larry was a US Army veteran who fought in the Vietnam War, but was also described as being a sexual deviant who would wear his wife and daughter's underwear and makeup, and had a mixture of both jealousy and fascination with seeing his wife have intercourse with other men and women. In 1965, Larry became a probationary officer, but was fired after assaulting an African-American man whom he accused of sleeping with his wife. In 1988, Larry briefly worked as a mail carrier, but quit after just 3 months and did very little work, having brought most of his mail home to destroy it. By now, you can probably tell that he wasn't a good influence on his children. Larry didn't share his income with the family and impulsively spent any money he earned on himself, purchasing guns, motorcycles and cars. His children often had to visit the homes of extended family members just to ask for food because they were starved at home. When Melinda was 5, her parents became heavily involved with the Graceland Baptist Church. Larry became a Baptist lay preacher, and Marjorie became the school nurse. The church later arranged for Melinda to be taken to a motel room with a 50-year-old man for a 5-hour exorcism. Larry soon acquired a reputation for being too forward with the women at the church, eventually attempting to sexually assault one of them. After this incident, the Lovelace parents left the church after 2 years. Melinda's mother put up with the abuse that Larry made her endure. He'd often take his wife to bars where he'd introduce himself as a doctor or a dentist and tell people that she was just his girlfriend. Despite her disgust, he would also make his wife sleep with his co-workers. This led to Marjorie attempting suicide on multiple occasions. Melinda was just 9 years old when her father had her mother sexually assaulted by a gang, after which she tried to drown herself. In the summer of 1986, after she would not let him go home with 2 women he met at a bar, Larry beat Marjorie so severely that she was hospitalised. Larry would often embarrass his daughters by smelling their used underwear in front of other family members. There are various claims that he fondled Melinda as an infant, and she slept in his bed until he abandoned the family when she was 14. Melinda's cousin Teddy, who was also molested by Larry, claims that he once seen Larry tie up all 3 of his daughters in the garage to molest them. However, Melinda would never speak about any abuse that she endured. In November of 1990, after Larry was caught spying on Melinda and a friend, Marjorie attacked him with a knife. He was sent to the hospital after he attempted to grab it. She then attempted suicide again, and her daughters called authorities. After this, Larry filed for divorce and moved to Avon Park, Florida. Melinda felt crushed, especially when Larry remarried. He sent letters to her for a while, playing on her emotions, but eventually severed all contact. Amanda Heverin, Shanda's new girlfriend, had begun dating Melinda Loveless in 1990, in the midst of her abuse with her father. Melinda was behaving very erratically around this time, often getting into fights at school, complaining of depression, and having to receive professional counselling. In March of 1991, Melinda disclosed her lesbian orientation to her mother, who was initially furious, but eventually accepted it. As the year progressed, Melinda's relationship with Amanda deteriorated. Even though they never formally broke up, Melinda later started to date an older girl. However, when she spotted Amanda and Shanda together at the school dance, she became very jealous at seeing her ex with a new girlfriend. Melinda had confronted Amanda and Shanda. An argument broke out, but it was clear that Melinda was old news, and Amanda was happy with her newfound relationship. After the school dance, Melinda began to discuss killing Shanda and would threaten her in public. Shanda, of course, told her parents about Melinda's growing rage, and this frightened her parents so much so that they had Shanda transfer schools, sending her to a Catholic school in late November. Amanda was also receiving constant letters from Melinda containing death threats towards Shanda, which was shown to a youth prosecutor, but nothing was done about it as far as she knows. Even though Shanda had moved schools, the pair continued their relationship. Now to briefly address a few of Melinda Loveless's friends. Laurie Tackett, a friend of Melinda's, was 17 years old in 1992. Her father also had past felonies, and Laurie claimed that she was molested at least twice by her father at ages 5 and 12. Her mother was a strictly religious woman and made Laurie wear very conservative outfits. However, when she discovered that Laurie had been changing into jeans at school, her mother attempted to strangle her. Laurie became very rebellious, gaining a deep interest in the occult, often pretending to be possessed to impress her friends, self-harming, and she also began to date a girl. When her mother discovered her self-harm, she checked her daughter into a hospital. She was later released, but 2 days later she attempted to slash her wrist with her girlfriend. She was then sent to a psychiatric ward where she was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Laurie was discharged on April 12th and dropped out of school in September. By October, she moved by herself from Madison, Indiana, and began to stay with friends in Louisville. This is when she first met Melinda in November of 1991. She later moved back to Madison on the promise that her father would buy her a car, but still travelled back to Louisville regularly and spent a large amount of time with Melinda. The next friend of Melinda's was Hope Ripper, who was 15 years old in 1992. Hope's parents divorced in February of 1984, and she had moved with her mother and siblings to Quincy, Michigan. Her relationship with her family was very turbulent. Her parents resumed their relationship in Madison, Indiana in 1987. She was reunited with friends Laura and Tony Lawrence, whom she had known since childhood, although her parents saw Laura as a bad influence. As with the other girls, Rippy began to self-harm at age 15. Tony Lawrence is the final friend in the group. She was also 15 years old in 1992, and like the others, she had also had quite a broken childhood and was abused by a relative at age 9 and sexually assaulted by a teenage boy at age 14. She went into counselling after the incident but did not follow through. She became promiscuous, began to self-harm, and attempted suicide in 8th grade. As you can tell, these were all very troubled teenagers whose upbringing and influences on one another eventually led to be deadly. It was bitterly cold on the night of January the 10th, 1992, when Melinda Loveless enlisted her 3 friends to help carry out one of the most senseless and brutal murders in Indiana's state history. That night, Laura, Hope, and Tony drove in the car that Laurie's father had bribed her to move back home with and drove over to Melinda's house. Tony had not previously met Melinda at this point, despite being childhood best friends with the other girls. When they arrived at Melinda's house, Melinda showed the girls the knife that she was going to scare Shanda with, and no doubt try and intimidate her. All of the girls already knew of Melinda's plan to scare Shanda with the knife, and how much she hated Shanda for believing her to be a copycat and for stealing her girlfriend. The girls somehow knew that Shanda would stay at her father's house at the weekends in Jeffersonville, and so proceeded there, stopping at McDonald's en route to ask for directions. They arrived at Shanda's father's home, and the plan went as follows. Melinda instructed Tony and Hope to knock on the door. They would then invite Shanda to come with them to see Amanda, who was waiting for them at the Witch's Castle, or Mistletoe Falls, a ruined stone house located on an isolated hill overlooking the Ohio River. Shanda said that she could not go because her parents were awake, so they'd have to come back later, around midnight, and she'd be able to sneak out. Melinda was angry at first. The other girls assured her though that they'd go back for Shanda later on. The 4 girls then crossed the river to Louisville and attended a punk rock show by the band Sunspring. Tony and Hope quickly lost interest in the music and went out to the parking lot, where they engaged in sexual activities with 2 boys in Laurie's car. When they arrived at Shanda's house at 12:30 a.m, Laurie and Hope went to the door to retrieve Shanda. Melinda hid under the blanket in the back seat of the car with a knife. Hope told Shanda that Amanda was still waiting for her at the Witch's Castle, but Shanda was reluctant to go. After some persuasion, Shanda changed her clothes and left her house with the girls. As they got into the car, Hope began questioning Shanda about her relationship with Amanda. Melinda then sprang out from the back seat, put the knife to Shanda's throat, and began interrogating her about her sexual relationship with Amanda. They drove over to the Witch's Castle. At the Witch's Castle, they took a sobbing Shanda inside and bound her arms and legs with rope. Once there, Melinda taunted her that she had pretty hair and wondered how pretty she would be if they were to cut it off. This frightened Shanda even more. Melinda began taking off Shanda's rings and handed one each to the girls. At some point, Hope had taken Shanda's Mickey Mouse watch and danced to the tune that it played. Laurie further taunted Shanda, claiming that the Witch's Castle was filled with human remains, and Shanda's would be next. To further threaten Shanda, Laurie then retrieved a shirt with a smiley design from the car and lit it on fire, but immediately feared that the fire would be spotted by passing cars, so the girls left with Shanda. During the car ride, Shanda continued begging them to take her home. Melinda ordered Shanda to slip off her bra, which she then handed over to Hope, who slid off her own bra and replaced it with Shanda's while steering the wheel. They became lost, so they stopped at a gas station and covered Shanda with the blanket. Whilst Laurie went inside to ask for directions, Tony called a boy that she knew in Louisville and chatted for several minutes to ease her worries, but did not mention Shanda's abduction. They returned to the car but became lost again and pulled up to another gas station. There, Tony and Hope spotted a couple of boys and talked to them once again before getting back into the car and leaving, arriving sometime later at the edge of some woods near Tackett's home in Madison. At a remote trash dump in a densely overgrown area, Loveless and her gang stripped the clothes from Shanda's body, punched her repeatedly, sprayed window cleaner in her eyes. For nearly 8 hours, the girls sexually assaulted and tortured Shanda Sharer, except for Tony Lawrence, who refused to participate. Shanda was screaming, but since the girls were down a remote path, no one could hear those screams for help. The torture continued on for hours before the girls tossed Shanda into the back of the car's trunk. They attempted to slit her throat, but the knife brought by Loveless was too dull, so instead, they repeatedly stabbed her in the chest. Believing Shanda was now dead, they drove to Laurie Tackett's home to clean up and drink sodas. They had no idea that their victim was screaming inside the car's trunk. From the house, Tackett and Loveless drove off together, where they found another remote location, and stabbed Shanda several more times before sodomizing her with a tire iron. They returned to Tackett's house and joked to their friend Ripper about what they just did. Now approaching dawn, the foursome stopped at a gas station and purchased a 2-litre bottle of Pepsi, which they drank and immediately refilled with gasoline. The girls then drove to another remote location and pulled Shanda out of the trunk. Wrapped in a blanket and whimpering the word mummy in a defeated tone, the girls then dragged Shanda Sharer to a clearing in the forest. The girls poured gasoline from the now filled Pepsi bottle and watched as she was burned alive. The killers drove off, but shortly came back to the body, where they believed that she was completely burned up with no trace of evidence. Upon seeing that she was not, they repeated the process of burning her body once again. Besides the brutal murder of Shanda Sharer, one of the most disturbing facts of the case is that the girls ate breakfast at McDonald's immediately after the torturous ordeal and killing. The killers laughed as they compared their sausage breakfast with Shanda Sharer's charred remains. Shanda's brutalised body was eventually found by a local hunter, Don Fowler, the next morning. Later that afternoon, Loveless called her ex-girlfriend, Amanda Heverin, to brag about what she and her friends had done to Shanda Sharer. Heverin did not believe that anyone would commit such an awful murder and played it off as a joke. Around this time, Tony Lawrence, who had refused to participate, and Hope Ripper went to the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, where they confessed to the murder. The next day, the murderous four were all in handcuffs and the investigation had begun. The state of Indiana decided to try all of the girls involved in the murder as adults, and all four accepted a plea bargain from the state to avoid the death penalty. Lawrence and Ripper, who were less involved in the torture, received 20 years and 50 years respectively, and are both now out of prison. In one recorded interview, Tackett said, "I didn't know Shanda at all. I didn't go into that evening knowing anything was going to happen, wanting anything to happen." Tackett then blamed her role on peer pressure from Melinda Loveless. Tackett and Loveless both received 60-year prison sentences. Laurie Tackett was released from Rockville Correctional Facility on January the 11th, 2018, the 26th anniversary of Shanda's death. She had served nearly 26 years and has completed an additional year of parole. Melinda Loveless was released from Indiana Women's Prison on September the 5th of 2019. She too had served 26 years in prison and will serve the rest of her parole in Jefferson County.